slight segue, but I think a really important thing that we should talk about is hiring a creative strategist. So I think a lot of people who potentially listen to this might be interested to, like, maybe have hired graphic designers before. You know, the creative strategist role is this new enigmatic, you know, kind of mystery position. And I think a lot of agencies define it differently. A lot of agencies execute it differently. So I think, you know, I mean, you've obviously hired a fantastic creative strategist. So we should probably talk about that a little bit, I think, as well, because that is kind of going back to like the requirements when you're looking for someone to fill those roles. I would say, although for me as a creative strategist, I don't know necessarily color psychology and I don't necessarily know hierarchy of text, I think was one of the examples you just gave there. That's how little I know about it. But I think it comes back to experience again, like that passion and that experience. Like I've seen, God, I used to oversee a team that managed 22 million a year in spend. So the amount of creatives I've seen, the amount of campaigns I've seen, the amount of like just the experience of performance marketing as a whole, and specifically performance marketing creative that I've seen, I have a good gut instinct, I think, of like what's going to work and what's not going to work. And that doesn't come from being book smart about color psychology and text hierarchy. It comes from experience of millions and millions of millions in ad spend, of seeing what type of creatives work and being able to spot those patterns and recreate those patterns to recreate that good performance. So I guess question back to you then would be, when you were hiring for a creative strategist, what was really important for you? What were you looking for?
That's a really good question. It's funny that you said the gut reaction. I was literally typing, we use acronyms a lot. So I put MB, media buyer experience, helping create gut reaction of a CS, creative strategist. I think that is one thing that is very important for a creative strategist to have. And as we're working on helping designers and copywriters in our team, when they come on board, learn how to read data, is helpful for them to grow as well, is when you run ads for so long, you just start to get that sixth sense or that second nature of as soon as you see the ad, you can, now, of course, you want to test everything, but you can just assume, oh, I've seen this in the past. This is what happens wrong with this. This is probably why this is not going to perform. And you can use that to really lead where you're going with things. Now, to answer your question, what was I looking for with a creative strategist? Luckily, avenue-wise, you came via referral of someone in my network. And I have found consistently that referrals from people in network are the best source of new talent versus, hiring someone off LinkedIn or Indeed. Those are all great channels. But if you have someone who is experienced working with someone and has confidence that they'll fit your company culture, always a great path to go for. I was definitely looking for someone with media buying experience. And I mean, I'll just kind of air it out. The creative strategist role, while it's a new title, it's not really a new responsibility, but it is at the same time. I feel like the industry is kind of figuring out, is it a copywriter? Is it a media buyer with, I don't use the term common sense, but is it a media buyer with good consumer psychology and communication understanding? What is it? To me, I was definitely looking for a team member that had experience in media buying so that they could have that gut nature. And then looking for someone that knew, I feel like with the creative strategist role, it's knowing what to say and when to say it in the touch points or in the user journey that way. So someone that had the experience to be able to do that. I guess the term I'm looking for is comprehension. Right? Like comprehension as a marketer, because you could be very, very tactical at one specific thing and know how to design the best creative or know how to write the best copy from a structure standpoint or a tactical standpoint, but being able to piece those things together and lead the charge with a team of understanding, okay, this is top of funnel, so we should be doing these certain types of things. This is retargeting, we should be doing these certain types of things. This is the product focus, and this is the audience, and this is how this audience wants to engage with this type of brand. Kind of rambling at this point, but really, I don't have a better term for it other than just comprehension. or street smarts, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah. And it's really crazy actually now, because being in like a really hands-on creative strategy role at the moment and not being involved in media buying is so crazy for me. But I can't imagine how the heck creative strategists get by in their role without ever being media buyers. And I say this, I ask you these questions all the time. Like, so, previous creative strategists in this role, how have they been doing this without being able to find their way around an ad account? How have they been getting, I don't know, screenshots of the creative with the headline, with the social proof on it? How have they been, understanding like the data and the funnels, like exactly what you said there? I'm going to use the same word, comprehension. How have they been doing the role? And I think it's obviously going to be impossible for me to visualize the creative strategist role without being a media buyer, because I am a media buyer. But I don't know, like, it's just wild to me that exists and that people do that. And I guess it's having good tools in place, right? So, and actually this is kind of what we're working on at the moment, is passing on some of my creative strategist knowledge to someone else internally in the team. And this is exactly what I actually am going to be charged with figuring out, because he isn't a media buyer. But we do have really good tools in terms of the supermetrics reports that we use, the creative reporting that we use. I know you've shared that on LinkedIn before as well, if anyone wants to have a look. Is getting the data to the person who's in that role in a way that they can understand it and know how to interpret that and what that means for future creatives. Like, I gave him a little mini monologue recently about, he was asking, how do you decide how many videos versus how many images versus what to put in a creative package? And I gave him a bit of a rundown of how meta works and how if you have a purely video strategy, you're going to miss a huge part of your audience who don't like to consume video on social media. By the way, that's me, never consume video on social media. So I always bang on about this with clients, because it's like, well, you might think that statics don't work for you, but there's a whole part of your audience that you're not reaching if you don't put static ads out there. And he's not a media buyer by nature, the guy in my department who I'm training with this. So he wouldn't know that. And it's those little nuanced things that come up which spark that question for me of like, how does a creative strategist that isn't a media buyer navigate this and kind of come up with the right responses and strategies?
And I guess a bigger question to that, I mean, it kind of goes back to the question I was asking about, do you train a creative strategist on like the basics of graphic design or copywriting if they don't have that? In our training flow that we're building out for a creative strategist, should we add in like dedicated days or hours or whatever it may be to shadowing a media buyer or to shadowing certain parts of the agency? Do you feel like that would be excessive? Just kind of trying to think through this as we record here.
Yeah, no, well, that's where the juice comes, isn't it? I actually did speak to the guy I'm training in the team, and I said, hey, look, would you be interested in having like a kind of crash course in meta media buying? I said, I said, I want to just gauge whether you're interested for a start. Like, I'm not going to force you to learn something. You've been hired in this role. Now we're kind of like maybe moving you into more of a creative strategist position. Like, you might think, I couldn't give two hoots about media buying. That's a waste of my time. That's not what I'm here for. So I said to him, are you interested in learning, the bare bones, I guess, or the basics of it, to be able to find your way around an ad account and get information that you might need to help you as a creative strategist? And he said, yeah, absolutely. Because, when we do a lot of shadowing work together, like I'll sometimes be leading and talking him through my reasoning for putting together certain things in a brief. And sometimes I let him lead and then I'll like chirp in sometimes. And sometimes when I go into the ad accounts and I'm sharing screen, he's like, I would never have been able to get that if you weren't here on this call with me. And that also sparked the same thing in my mind of, okay, so should we in our creative strategy training flow have some kind of basics of media buying in there?
Yeah, and that'll be a separate episode we record on that, that media buyer creative strategist relationship. And because one gap that can come from that, and we'll go into this more in depth when we have our surveys in from creative strategists and look at pain points they have. But one could be, is it the media buying work or is it the creative that is causing negative performance? Like, is it because of the audience selection and the campaign structuring and X, Y, and Z, or is it because the creative just did not perform well? Right. And having at least enough information and time in seat or just experience to be able to challenge performance, because it might not be because of the actual creative, but because of the execution of the media buying, can be something that could be very important as well.
Yeah. And there was an instance of that really recently as well, where one of the accounts was mostly being run with cost caps, and that was working really well for the account in the BAU. And then when new creative was being tested, it was being put into the normal kind of testing campaign, which was usually ABO, broad audience, enough spend to be able to optimize, etc. And I looked in the ad account and none of my creatives were performing well. And when I looked, I was like, well, yeah, I mean, new creative, not established, no learnings there, no social proof, is never going to outperform something in a cost cap campaign, which is literally designed to hit a specific goal. So that was, again, if not a media buyer, I wouldn't have looked in the account and seen that and thought, that's something we need to look at, because that's not really a apples to apples comparison for my creative versus we can't say this creative is, performing worse than the account average CPA. Well, of course it is, because it's not in a cost cap campaign and everything else is. So not having the media buy experience and knowing what that means would have potentially then, right, we'll write off that whole brief. Nothing worked there. Let's never use that motivator again. Let's never use that creative style again. And that's potentially quite damaging.
Yeah. And as agencies grow, it can be easy to, or not easy, it can be less of a priority to have like a unicorn hunt. I think I worded that wrong. As a smaller team agency, it can be beneficial for somebody to have multiple expertise or experience. And where I'm going with this is, if you look at creative strategists as well, you asked what I was looking for in that role. Someone who can understand how their work is affecting the business as a whole, or just taking the business objectives, product focus, collection focus, demographic or market focus, based on margins, based on product rollouts, quantities, needs to lift AOV, and build out creative that can meet those objectives, more so than just like, let's get some purchases, right? Like, let's just get positive ROAS. Positive ROAS are great, but there can be alternative objectives that businesses can have that will help their business ultimately grow in the direction they want to go in. And where I was getting at with the larger agency is, you could definitely have a team lead or a pod leader that could be the strategist on those things, and you could have a creative strategist that works under it. But in part, what I was looking for when it came to hiring you was someone that could own that as well and have that understanding of the business as a whole to go into their work as well.
Yeah. And I think you've raised a really good point there, actually. When I was doing the initial audits, when I first came on board with Bride to Click, and putting together plans for creative strategy for clients, I was looking at stuff like that. I was looking at, right, okay, AOV is, not great here, despite what the average price of the products actually are. So maybe we could try some bundles. Maybe we could try some bundle creatives. Like, actually, I can see you've got bundles on the site. Let's do some creatives specifically for those bundles and see if we can get AOV up from the media spend that we're putting through the ad account. So yeah, again, another, I think, tick in the column of having someone in the creative strategy seat who's got that media buying understanding and the metrics. Coming back to the data again, I think, isn't it? And we've talked about this so much for copywriter and graphic designer, about ability to read data. And actually, at my old agency, just before I left, I was helping with some creative strategist hiring, and I would say, actually, and I saw a lot of candidates, it was probably 50-50, the people that could read media buying data and not read media buying data. And that really surprised me. Again, it's really hard for me to envision a creative strategy role without being a media buyer or data led. So maybe that's why it surprised me personally. But it's a really interesting dilemma for sure. So to summarize that, I guess then your recommendation, and I think I'm definitely agreeing based on my own experience, would be if anyone is hiring for a creative strategist, the media buying experience definitely is a help and a plus.
Yeah, and I would love to hear, I agree with you 100%, but I would also love to hear outside opinion, anybody listening that feels differently, that maybe someone that has copywriting experience, no media buying experience, could be in the role, non-problematic with understanding data and stuff like that. And you have a system, you have a team structure that allows for that. I'd love to hear that as well, just to hear what that looks like from a different agency perspective on your org
You
chart.
know, now you say that, in my old agency, our creative strategist, when I was head of the department, he was a copywriter by, kind of trade, I guess, and experience. And yeah, that worked successfully for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
That he was the one that came up with the ideas and the angles. We used to call him the Don Draper of the agency because he just had a way with words, like obvious. Honestly, like also the funniest guy I've ever met, like just hilarious, just has a way with words. Copywriters, I think, are so smart. And yeah, that worked really well for a while. We were starting to kind of, get a lot more data heavy involved. And that was a bit of a learning curve in terms of like, okay, how can I help you understand the data? How can we bring this in more? And it just takes a lot of collaboration, like ask the questions, listen to the responses, build something that works for the person in that seat, because it's very easy for me to look at data and go, oh, but you can see this, obviously the click-through rate is rubbish on that one, but for someone who doesn't do that, that is not immediately obvious. So yeah.
Yeah, those tactical things so important, and the things that I do go back to that I think are universal for any role. And I was actually just at Shop Talk this week, and I was listening to, I think it was 3 or 4 larger agencies, uh, C-suite or owners were on stage, and they were talking about hiring. To me, the most important things are those soft skills, right? Does the person communicate well? Do they proactively communicate with clients and internal team? Do they proactively manage their projects? Are they on top of making sure that there is good communication so that things are delegated properly? Like those soft skills, to me, are things that you can't really train into somebody in a short period of time. It has to be something that people understand, they get, and they come with. And if you don't have those soft skills, especially as a remote team at BrighterClick, it becomes very problematic very quickly for the entire team, honestly.
One of the things you said actually as well recently to me that I think is a really good call out. How did you describe it? It was about like people taking, I guess it's about ownership and kind of like seeing things through to completion,
Mm-hmm.
and what a difference it makes when you have team. And I think again, this is especially important for remote teams, is making sure that you have people who don't need to be chased and don't need to be reminded. And I think part of that is, as an agency, having the right systems in place, like project management tools,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But even then, like if you're constantly having to chase someone to like finish a task or get an update on a task, those types of soft skills are also, I think, really key for success. So how would you go about looking for that if you were interviewing or hiring for a role?
That's a good question. The thing you might have mentioned, or the thing you might be referencing, because I'm going through my head of different phrases and stuff, but one thing I did tell you recently was updates aren't just for completion of task, but for gradual project management. In other words, if there is something that needs to get done today and it has a due date of today, and for some reason the team member is not able to complete it today, there still needs to be an update at the end of the day on where it is, why it didn't get done, and when it will get done, versus just waiting until it is completed, because then the person that delegated is just sitting around waiting for an update or having to chase it down, right? And
Yeah.
my personal perception, and there is no black and white universal with this, but my personal perception is if you're not providing those updates, you don't care. Like you're just not on top of the project. You don't care enough to bring forward an update and to make sure that everybody is looped in. And I'll give you a quick example, and then I'll go back to your question of how I look for that. I'm working on building a software right now. I have a potential co-founding CTO that's working on the project with me. And Monday, Tuesday of this week, he was asking for a certain permission level in AWS so that we could make sure that he was able to track cost of the build that we're doing. And we had a back and forth through email. I ended up giving him the access. He told me I'll check for it when I get to needing it. I'm dialed in on doing, X, Y, Z for the build. I said, okay. Last night at, 9 p.m., because he works different hours, he just randomly sent me an email and said, hey, just letting you know, I got the permissions that I needed. We're all good here. He could have just not told me anything and just assumed that I knew, you know what I mean? But I didn't know. I wasn't even necessarily looking for that update, but it still checks it off in my head. So now I know it's not a responsibility that's open anymore.
Yeah. That it's not chewing up space anymore. It's not like holding space that can be released in your mind of like, oh, did he get those permissions? I should probably check with him just in case there's something else I need to do. Like it's the mental load, isn't it?
And yes, and I will get to your question, but I just want to resonate on that for a second. Anyone that's listening that is in a role that is getting delegated to, even if you're a creative strategist delegating to others, but you report to someone, more than likely, whoever is delegating to you, while they may not be asking for an update, it is still in the back of their mind and they're still concerned about it. They're still thinking about it. It's taking up bandwidth. It's taking away from other things that need to get done. And just because they may not be reaching out to you to ask about it, it's on the top of their mind. It's something that's taken up their memory bank and it's slowing them down in one way or another.
Yeah.
So
just on that, just real quick before we get to my question, was one of the best things, career advice pieces I ever read was like, and I'm definitely going to butcher it and not do it justice, but it basically was around like making your manager's job easy and making your manager look good is one of the easiest ways to progress in your career. And that's a great example of that. Like, just because your manager isn't asking you for the update doesn't mean they're not thinking about it. So how can you make their job easier? You can proactively tell them. And, your manager might be getting pressure as well to give like, well, why is this not done? Why is this client's stuff not been ready, like not been finished? Why have I been asking for this task for 2 weeks? And, making their job as easy as possible is always going to serve you well. And it's always, I just don't think it's even, I would go as far as to say, I don't think it's possible to over communicate.
So important. And to take the time, and this can fall mostly on the manager or the owner or the C-suite, whatever, how big your team is, but it's helpful as a employee, if you're looking to move up, is to take the time to really think through like, what is this person's communication style and how do they want things communicated? Like, are they, if you're looking at the DISC profile, like, are they very direct and do they want short bullet point, to the point, this or that? Are they more on the S or C side and they want more thought, more details, longer text, things like that as well? And to get back to your question on how do I look for the proactive communication? How do I try to find that in the hiring process? This is something I'm continuing to try to optimize. Honestly, I'm learning as I go. I think a lot of it can come into the trial project, but even before the trial project, actually, I tweeted recently, if you're looking for a new job, send a recap email at the end of your first interview. Like, treat it like you're a sales rep at a company, right? If somebody were to send me a recap email after their first interview and be talking about next steps and clarity on that, instantly moving to the top. If there's nothing else that's a red flag, instantly moving to the top of the board because it's showing that they own it so well. And into the trial project, and somebody listening might say that this is a malpractice or something like that, but nonetheless, one thing that I will do in the trial projects as well is purposefully put mistakes or lack of information for certain tasks that is the same for everybody. So everybody's getting an equal opportunity with the trial project, but everybody is either going to have the same lack of information in one area or the same confusion or mistake, because I want to understand who's going to who's going to slow down and send a message in Slack and ask for clarity on it? Who's comfortable enough to communicate like that? And then we also ask or require that at the end of each day for the trial project, they send a proactive update on where things are, how things are going. We also require that they move the project cards in the ClickUp project board for their trial project as they go through it and send an update in ClickUp when things are done. And it's those things, it's the comfortability to ask questions, to raise your hand when there's an issue, to come for help versus just sitting in it and maybe doing something incorrectly, or the ability to be proactive with your updates at the end of the day. Because if someone is not doing that in the trial project when they're likely at their peak performance that they will be at with you in terms of being on their toes, they are not going to do it 3 months to 6 months into the project or into the role either.
Yeah. Let's talk about, I think maybe it'd be good to talk about that a little bit more as well, because there are like definitely differences. Like when my previous agency, we did an exercise, which was a one-off task with like set instructions that the person then delivered to us, and we could kind of like assess the work. One of the things that I asked in every exercise, I'm nearly called it a trial then, it's very different, and that's kind of my point, which I'll get to, was to do a Loom video of them looking at data. So I would always ask for the media buying role, we would always give them access to an ad account and ask them to film a Loom of looking at the last 7 days versus the previous 7 days performance, talk about what had changed and give us their reasons why they thought it would change and what they would recommend to do next, so that you can kind of get a feel for how they navigate through ad accounts, how they, do they know about things like the compare function and like opening the columns up, and you can get a sense of how proficient they are with the tool. However, what I think now I look back at that is maybe a drawback versus the way you do things with like a trial project, is it's a very static one-off piece of work. What I love about coming over with Click and working with you on the trial projects is all of those things that you just talked about there, in terms of like asking them to send an update at the end of the day, asking, making sure that they're asking questions, putting something in there that may be intentionally a bit confusing to see how they handle it. When you give an exercise as part of a hiring process, you don't actually get that same level of insight of what would it be like working alongside this person. And I think that's a huge difference, and I think a really important one to know, because when you're hiring, you absolutely want someone in the seat next to you who you want to work with. That's just the way it is, that's just the way it goes. And with a static one-off exercise, you don't get that same level of visibility.
Yeah, and I think that the trial project is of course about skill, but ideally by that phase, because we've done the pre-interview form, the interview, we've done something we haven't talked about yet, which was reference calls, calling past employers, calling past managers, and then a secondary interview. Ideally, we have a good understanding of their skill. Like, of course, it's still good to see it in action. People can talk a talk. We want to make sure that they can walk it as well. And we will do things like, Loom video in the trial project. But to me, the biggest part of the trial project is not just so that the agency can understand if they want to work with the new team member, contractor, employee, whoever it may be. It's also so that they can understand if they want to work with this new agency, like if it's going to be a good fit for them. So if that, I always go back to, if communication, if proactivity is not there, it's likely not going to be a good fit. So having it to where it's a 1 to 2, 2 to 3, I'll just say 2 to 3 day experience for them, fully paid, is good, because it really saves you a lot of time down the road of figuring out 6 months in that this person may not be a good fit. And you want to slow down to speed up in that phase and really challenge what's happening and what you're experiencing. And by that, I mean, create a checklist for the role. Like, you've already have the job scorecard you've built out, create a checklist and grade each person that's in the trial project on it and see who gets the best gut check or who gets the best feel based off of that.
Yeah, that was really useful. Actually, we did that with both the roles that we recently filled, the graphic designer and the copywriter one, didn't we? And I know the copywriter role, which was the second role we filled, we were a little bit more structured with it than we were the first time round in terms of like having a space and click up where we put the scores. And I think that was really, really helpful to kind of have it all, like do that exercise of going through and scoring each candidate, not just on the output of the work, but also, like you said, those softer skills. And you mentioned there about it being a paid trial. That's, maybe something we should talk about a little bit more. So in previous agency where we did the exercise, it was intentionally not too long because we didn't offer payment for it. It wasn't a piece of work that we needed done in the agency. It was just a bit of a test, I guess, an exercise to see how they approach stuff. So do you want to talk a little bit more about how you price up trial projects, how you come to like how much you're going to pay somebody, that kind of stuff? I think would be really useful if someone's considering implementing something similar in their hiring.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for starters, with a trial project, ideally it's not just going to be a useless project to grade someone on. Like if you have, let's say you have a client that has creative that needs to be done in the next 5 days and you have 3 trial projects that are going to get started, give them that client. Like you already have someone doing that internally, but give them that so that you can grade them against each other and you can grade them against your current team and understand how they're performing. And so it's something that could be usable. Like you're getting a benefit off of it because you can give it to the client that way. When it comes to pricing trial projects, and I'm looking specifically at non-managerial roles when I say this, because those can be a little bit different, but focus on what is the pay range that you're planning on doing for the role? Let's say it's $60K a year, just, a number, throw it out there. How can you figure out what the day rate is for that? And then pay based off of the day rate, right? So pay based off of 2 days, 3 days, whatever it may be. And then, set a cap on it, because if somebody starts to go over, they're probably not a good fit. If everybody else is finishing and they're not, but if there's any issues created on their end, think through that. But that's generally the way that I go with it. I'm sure there's other ways that you could set a soft cap for a project, and I've tested that as well. But the day rate, equation generally is a pretty reliable way to go with.
Nice. No, I think that'll help.
So, and what I will, circle back to as we kind of wrap up, you've gone through an entire process of vetting, interviewing, testing in a trial project, and you move into onboarding. You know, I don't have any clear data on this. This is all speculative, but as a remote team, right, it could be very easy for somebody to give their best effort in a trial project and pass with green flags, and then slowly lose performance over the next 2 to 3 months. That could be because of maybe there wasn't an alignment in what their true passion is, like we've talked about, and they're not passionate about the role. They could have, just like you're sourcing talent, source talent to complete the trial project. If you don't have things like Loom videos to make them explain stuff and show you and gauge their comprehension, and then they could dwindle down once they get in, right? They could be taking on other projects. Anything could happen. And it goes back to the acronym ABR, which is always be recruiting. Ideally, you get in a bad spot at the end of the trial project where you have 2 or 3 really talented people you're trying to choose between. You make a choice, and then you stay in communication with the other opportunities, and you keep recruiting, because just because you brought somebody on and they're starting day one, really it takes until 3 months to 6 months to understand if you made a good choice. Of course, there can be quicker situations, but if you're really wanting to grade off of performance with the scorecards, keeping that ABR is very helpful so that you can have a backfill and you don't get into this cycle of just hiring out of desperation and not meeting the needs of the role.
And I think one thing you touched on there, which is really important actually, and we haven't talked about so much, is onboarding, but also a probationary period. Like that's definitely in all the agencies I've worked in been absolutely vital for making sure that the new hire that comes in has an idea of what's expected of them, because there's nothing worse than when you're the hired person and you don't really have you have a job description that you applied for, but you don't actually know what good looks like in your role. That's extremely challenging for both the agency, but more so for the person that's been hired to know what they're supposed to be kind of doing. What does good look like? How can I impress you? Like, what are the things that I can do that can really set me aside and make a good impression in my first 30, 60, 90 days? And I think, having a job scorecard that you mentioned there and probationary period is really key for kind of both parties, really, in terms of making sure that hire was the right decision. Because everybody of course puts their best foot forward. It's like when you're dating, you're in the honeymoon phase, when you're doing the trial project, and maybe in the first month, and you're like pulling out all the stops and really kind of trying to impress, and rightly so. I kind of expect that when I'm hiring someone, but the baseline still needs to be at obviously a high performing level. Like, not everybody can give 100% every single day, like definitely not, and I wouldn't ever expect that from my team. But their baseline, their 70%, their the number that they turn up to work every single day needs to be hitting like the requirements of the role. So I think that's where having good onboarding and B review and probationary period with a really clear structure that's very clearly communicated to the hire what you expect of them in that 30, 60, 90-day period, making sure you have the reviews, slow down to speed up, take the time to go through that together, identify anything early that's like, this isn't so great, there's some opportunities for improvement here. How can we do that? Let's talk about that. How can we get you to being super successful in all of these areas? And then also, I think, what I've always said to my team is, I'll always be frank and honest with you if I've got something on my mind or if I've got feedback for you. If we're doing a 30-day, 60-day review, you're not going to hear it for the first time in that review. Like, I'll communicate with you like how your performance is going, because I think that's really important for me anyway, is that whole process being fair. Like, you don't want to get to the end of the 90 days and be like, do you know what, this isn't working out, and ask the person, like, say to the person, we're not going to move forward, and then be like, what the heck, I didn't see that coming. And I think if you as an agency are putting people in that position, I'd say you've probably got to have a look at your processes there and make sure that you're being fair to the employee, but B, also setting everybody in your kind of remit and in your team up for success.
1000%. And what you permit, you promote, right? So if you're allowing for issues, for things to happen, then you're really promoting it with your team. And what I've experienced and what you and I are working on right now, going back to those check-ins, is just discipline and consistency with having those, when somebody first comes on board, for the first week, have a quick 15-minute daily check-in, make sure they have what they need, they're finding everything, they're comfortable, they're onboarding. Then move it to maybe 3 times a week for 2 weeks, and then 2 times a week for 2 weeks, and then once a week. And being comfortable with calling out issues up front and having uncomfortable conversations, because what can easily happen if you're managing someone, I'll speak for myself, managing someone and you don't call those things out, is mentally things can just build, and you can start to lead to assumptions and wonders, and why is this happening? Well, it's probably happening because they are doing this or they don't care about that. Where you can have those upfront conversations with people and bring light to the issue, make sure they understand what they're doing is not meeting expectation, take the time to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and if it's a process issue, and if it's not, then what is it personal issue wise that things are going wrong. And having those performance reviews, we do them every 30 days. So the first 90 days is like a probation period. Every 30 days, we'll look at the scorecards and then have them, and you could elaborate on this a little bit because you did a very good job at this, or do a very good job at this, but have them grade themselves, and then you give them a grade on the call. Go through the scorecard together and focus on how performance is.
Yeah, I've always found that really useful, because I want to know where they think they're at, because that's really key for me in understanding, okay, if they think they're at exceeding expectations and I think they're under expectations, there's a real big misalignment there. And as the manager, that is on me 100% every time. Like, I obviously have not communicated clearly enough what my expectation is here if they think they're at one stage and I think they're at somewhere else. So it's really important. Like, that for me is actually to help me understand like how I can be better as a manager, as much as it is to understand where the team member feels like they are at with their performance. But I think it's really good to invite that self-reflection. And, you know, it's hard. Like, I would, like, again, I build all these processes and then I'm like, oh, I'm glad I don't have to like do all of them myself, because I would hate rating myself. I really would. But like, asking your team member for that level of self-reflection is as much to help them with their development as it is like anything really. Like, I mean, I'm the manager. If I don't think they're performing well enough, I could just sit there and tell them that, but that's not really kind of useful. Whereas if I get the chance, like, give them the chance to rate themselves, it helps me to understand and just help them. Like, if they then say, do you know what, actually, I'm going to say I'm underperforming here because of this, this, and this, you're giving them that space to have the self-reflection and to bring it to you, rather than you just saying, do you know what, you're underperforming here because of XYZ. Actually, it's kind of, I'd say, like, dignity is not the right word, but like, it gives them the chance to like call it out up front and own it, and like then maybe even come with a solution to you as the manager. And I could never ask for anything more than that, like, from a team member, is for to have that level of like honesty and to come with a solution. That is the best possible outcome for me. If a team member's underperforming, if they come at me kind of like that, then it makes the whole thing feel a lot better for everybody involved, I think.
And then to me, the most important part to cap that off, the performance reviews, or even, you know, write-ups, which is like performance write-ups prior to like a PIP, is monitoring for the next 2 to 3 weeks and make sure that what they told you, what they said needs to be worked on. Just like, you know, just like a relationship, right? What they said needs to be worked on actually gets some traction and things actually start happening. Of course, it's not going to be a today, tomorrow transformation, right? Depending on the severity of it, but making sure that they are putting forth effort to actually make that change and to go after it. Because if they're not, then it just turns into, you know, talk. And
Yeah.
when you get this gut feeling that somebody might not be a good fit and it just keeps kind of resonating because same issues keep occurring, that can, you know, sometimes be an indicator that maybe it isn't a good fit that way. I know an upcoming episode we'll be focusing on the dynamic between the media buyer and the creative strategist. We're going to have a good episode with Sarah Levenger on consumer psychology. We're going to have an episode with a sales consultant on selling creative services, and quite a bit more as we're building this out every day. Then, you know, new topics, new opportunities will be coming up and we'll be going through those.